Hello everyone, welcome to Shaun Academy. In this video, you're going to learn how to write a podcast business plan. Now, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to exit out of this presentation here. We're going to go straight to Grammarly.com. And this is where we're going to essentially begin writing our business plan for our podcast. Now, the first thing we're going to do here is we're going to create a title. We're going to call it Podcast Business Plan. So that's going to be our first title here. Now, the next thing we're going to put essentially is executive summary, actually 1.0 executive summary. Alrighty, so now we're just going to actually highlight this. We're going to make this heading number 2. Alrighty, so now when it comes to writing your executive summary for your podcast, you want to always keep it simple, keep it sweet, keep it straight to the point. You don't have to make it too complex, when you're writing your executive summary. So we're just going to make up a podcast name on the spot just so that we can have, a reference to how we're going to create our business plan here. So we're going to say that our podcast name is Craig's Podcast. So we're going to say something of the lines of Craig's Podcast is a brand new company that intends to dominate the podcasting industry. Right? Now we're going to say Craig's podcast content will be hosted on YouTube. Craig's podcast aims to produce valuable content that viewers and listeners will appreciate. So as you can see here, our executive summary, we're starting out pretty strong here. So we said here, Craig's Podcast is a brand new company that intends to dominate the podcasting industry. Craig's podcast content will be hosted on YouTube. Craig's podcast aims to produce valuable content that viewers and listeners will appreciate. Now we're going to say that the podcast revenue, right? Because we will make sure that that your potential investors can know because before anyone gives you money to start your business, no matter what your business is, whether it's local or you're trying to go global, right? Your investors, the person that's reading your business plan wants to know, how are you going to be able to generate money? What's the long-term plan and how is it going to be profitable? So we have to make sure that we get straight to that so they can already kind of see the vision of how you're going to be able to generate money. So we're going to say here is the podcast revenue will come from advertisers, right? So your podcast is going to come from advertisers and products sold on the website by the podcast core fan base. So basically we're telling the investors that your podcast revenue will come from advertisers, right? Because that's really where the money is at, from advertisements, right? And the products sold on the website by the podcast core fans. So let's say once you start, building a buzz around your podcast, you're going to have some very dedicated core. That's the beautiful thing about podcast is because you're making long content, it gives people the time to be invested in the podcast, be invested in the people who are involved in the show, and they're going to build some kind of attachment to the content maker, and you'll be able to build your influence, and by building your influence, you'll be able to tell people to buy certain products that's on your store. And you just have a lot more influential power when you have a podcast. That's one beautiful thing about it. That's why advertisers, they throw a lot of money towards people who have podcasts because they have a lot of influence. So basically we're telling our investors that your revenue is going to come from advertisers and your products that's going to be sold on your podcast, on your website from your core fan base. So now we're going to say, as the company grows, we will look to expand, and literally we're making this on the spot. So, this is just like, we're just thinking of, something that we're thinking of how investors want to see your business plan so that we could be able to kind of like interest them into reading more, you know? So we're going to say, as the company grows, we will look to expand our growth through sponsorships. So what's sponsorships? Sponsorships is basically like, let me actually put this here. So sponsorships, right? So what are sponsorships? It's basically, let's assume that you're the person. Let's say your name is Craig. You're Craig, right? So you're Craig and you have a podcast, and your podcast is growing, right? So sponsorships could just be, you may end up, maybe a company might maybe Sprite commercials or Coca-Cola commercials or any big commercials, maybe something, even medium-sized companies will probably want to contact you and say, hey, we want you on this commercial, and it's gonna, we're gonna give you this amount of money, and basically you'll be on a commercial. So that's sponsorship deals that you can have just from growing your podcast. A lot of things can happen. A lot of positive things can happen for you because you have a lot of influence. So basically sponsorships is something like that. So you have kind of like three ways of making revenue. You can make money from advertisers that are trying to advertise on your podcast. You can make money from your core fan base that you built over time because they like you and they like what your podcast is about and they like the people that's involved in it. And you or the people that's working for you in your podcast can get the sponsorship deal. So let's assume that you're Craig, but you have a friend on your podcast and his name is, I don't know, Frank, right? So let's say that you're not all that cool and you're not all that popular, but you're a friend who works for you and you have a contract with him. Frank is, he's really making the show really popular, making the show really interesting to watch. And Frank decides to go get a sponsorship deal. Now you'll be able to generate money from his sponsorship deals, depending on the contract that you guys agreed to. And whether you're popular or not, the podcast is popular. Frank is getting sponsorship deals. And, it's just a lot of money coming in all over the place, so you want to be thinking in those terms as well, so it says, as the company grows, we will look to expand our growth through sponsorships. And then we're going to say, from content creation by publisher and host to listeners discovery, the podcast industry is experiencing a creative and innovative renaissance. And like I said, with Grammarly.com, if you have any spelling mistakes, it basically just tells you, hey, look, you spelled this wrong, or hey, you typed this too fast. You need to recorrect your words. And that's the beautiful thing about using applications like this. You don't even have you don't need no one to proofread your content, your business plan. You can just use Grammarly.com. It'll tell you all the things that you've done wrong and you just fix it up from there. So we have here, it says, from content creation by publisher and hosted to listeners discovery, the podcast industry is experiencing a creative and innovative renaissance. So we're just basically explaining more about the podcast. So you always want to make sure that you're talking about how you're going to make money first. That's the first thing people want to see. So now we're going to talk more about the industry. So now we're going to say podcasts are becoming more popular outside of the United States, and Latin America is a key region to watch due to the rapid development of Spanish language content. So now we're just going to put in according. I actually have this information jotted on my thing here. So I'm just going to put this according to eMarketer. The number of US podcast listeners will increase 16% on year to year to 106.7 million. So basically, as you can see here, we have, it says, let me actually fix my spelling. All right, so basically we said, according to eMarketer, the number of US podcast listeners will increase 16% from year to year to 106.7 million. So basically this is, you can include this to your executive summary. You just explaining the industry briefly so they can understand what's going on there. Now let's talk a little bit about the market. So we're going to put here the market. So now we're going to say, we're going to talk about the market. So what about the market? All right, so let's just say the podcast audience is not only large and growing, but it is also appealing. Podcast listeners are typically young, affluent, and educated, right? Because think about it. What type of people listens to podcasts? Well, the type of people that listen to podcasts are usually people who are usually very well educated. They like to get deep into conversations, and they like to expand their knowledge. And usually those kind of people are usually financially in a good position, because a person who's able to think deeply, they're also usually able to stick through challenges and be able to rectify challenges. So usually people who like to listen to podcasts are the same kind of people who are doing financially well majority of the time. So they also have a lot of money to spend if they are enjoying the content, and they like what's going on with the people in the podcast. So we have here, says the podcast audience is not only large and growing, but it is also appealing. Podcast listeners are typically young, affluent, and educated, and they are generally open to advertising, which is true, because usually when they're watching advertisements, they actually do watch them, especially if it's a good advertisement. Usually people of these kinds that watch podcasts, when it comes to advertising, the way how the advertising has to be where it doesn't seem so generic. It has to be kind of like just regular advertising. Like those kind of the kind of advertisements that are put on podcasts are usually just the person just talking about the ads, rather than you showing like a commercial. So a lot of more, it's very low cost too for advertising for most businesses who are looking to advertise in people who have a podcast. So now we're going to say this is especially important for podcast ads, as the unreachable audience grows and advertisers may have more difficulty reaching younger, affluent, and looking and educated audience, who are likely to use technology such as ad blockers and other forms of digital media. So let me actually clean up here. As you can see, all the spelling mistakes that I've made here. This is the good thing about Grammarly. Just make sure that your business plan is looking professional and looking up to par. So now, as we can look here, basically we say the podcast audience is not only large and growing, but is also appealing. Podcast listeners are typically young, affluent, and educated, and they are generally open to advertising. This is especially important for podcast ads, as the unreachable audience grows, and advertisers may have more difficulty reaching younger, affluent, and educated audience, who are likely to use technology such as ad blockers and other forms of digital media. So basically, people who are of those kind of audience that you'll be targeting, they usually don't like ads they actually really don't like ads, but for some reason they're willing to watch ads through the podcast, depending on how that ad is being displayed. If the ad is being displayed where the host is talking about the particular ad, people are likely to watch it, because the thing about smart people is you can't really trick them, that's the problem. So, and there's a lot of value within those audience too. So you're likely to make a lot of money from advertisers because you have very quality viewers that are watching your content. So that's why starting a podcast business is very, very profitable, because of the kind of people that are watching it. It's not like a person watching TV who watch cartoons or watch dramas and stuff like that. These are people who are more than likely doing very well for themselves, more than likely, and they have the money to be able to purchase whatever products or whatever that the podcast is having. So so now next thing we're gonna talk a little bit more is about funding. So we're actually gonna add that to our section here, where it's gonna be called funding needed. Okay. So this is basically how much money we kind of need to get the ball rolling, right? So this is probably the important part right here. So we're gonna say, how much money do you need to start your podcast? Well, yeah, that's the goal. So we're gonna say we will need approximately $50,000 to grow our podcast, which will be used in advertising to get the podcast started. We will be able to repay. I'm just making this up, so I'm not sure, we're just throwing something in there just to complete the section. We will be able to repay by the end of next year. So I haven't really specified a specific date right now. So basically, as you can see, funding needed. All right. So why do we need this money, right? Okay. Well, here's the reason why. Okay. We need approximately $50,000 to grow our podcast, which will be used in advertising to get the podcast starting. So this is usually where most of the times where you're going to need the funding for is to get the ball rolling, right? So maybe with that $50,000, you could probably invest that in YouTube ads. You might be able to use that towards Facebook ads, Instagram ads, some social media platform ads, maybe Reddit, maybe Quora, maybe you may even need that $50,000 to be able to negotiate with other podcasters that can be able to, get you in there, or other influencers, so you can be able to just get the ball rolling. So you need some kind of capital in order to get your podcast moving, especially if you're going to be hosting it on YouTube, where the algorithm, you're going to be battling with the algorithm on trying to get your content to kind of rank up in the search engine or to be suggested by YouTube. But because one of the problems you're going to have when you're starting your podcast is that you're going to have 0 subscribers and you're going to have 0 views. And if you make 1 hour long content, no one's going to see it and it's not going to get any views, and you're going to feel like you're wasting your time. So you're going to have to need some money up front in order to get the ball rolling. Now, let's assume that you use $50,000. Okay, now you're spending it. Let's say that you got it yourself up to like 10,000 subscribers or constant, followers that you have. That's enough to get the ball rolling, because now after you have yourself like 10,000 subscribers, all you need to do from there is just keep posting videos, with putting the right keywords into your title and making sure that you're SEO optimized. And one of those videos is going to be the video that takes off. So you got to have a following first, so that you can keep posting content, so that one of those videos will be the video that really brings everybody into your podcast. So that's kind of how the algorithm works with the YouTube. So that's why it's going to be kind of like a little challenge. But the most important thing is to just have some build up a little following based. So that's a good reason why you would want some capital, so you could be able to kind of get that going. You don't need a lot of money though, but you do need some money in order to kind of negotiate your way through, breaking in the podcast industry, so you could be able to kind of claim some of the market share, So that's basically how you want to go about it. Now, but as you can see here, this is basically our podcast business plan. Very short, very simple. You can make it as complex as you want. We just made up a podcast name called Craig's Podcast on the spot. We're basically saying that it's a brand new company with the intentions of dominating the podcast industry. We're explaining a little bit about the market by letting the investor know, or the reader know, that that is a new kind of industry that's kind of growing rapidly. especially during what's what's going on now, and we need funding in order to be able to kind of get it going, because you need some kind of capital to get yourself moving. That's part of the investment plan. So now, and that's basically it. What you guys just watched here was how to write a podcast business plan. Thank you for watching this video. Take care.